So, this week, there were many things once again to do with the International Office. There was a games night with free snacks and some board games, and the Residency put on a nice little sort of art cafe thing. Some people drew banners for the hockey game coming up, and I drew some fun guys from my favourite analog horror, Vita Carnis. That would be the end of the week, and the video would end here. However, as I said last video, I've come up with some ideas to make these videos more interesting. So now, please allow me to go on a bit of a rant. As a part of my studies here in Canada, I've taken a course of the history of First Nations in Canada. As a part of this, I was tasked with analysing some of the problems with a documentary put out by the Canadian government about Canada's history. We would then come back as a class and together discuss these problems. Most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about was stuff that I had thought about when I first watched the video, but then was better articulated within these conversations with the professor and my fellow students. So please don't think that I came up with any of this out of nowhere. Regardless, don't take my word as gospel. I'm an undergraduate history student from the UK. If you want to understand the history of Canada, don't watch this video. Go and read a book. A link to the original video is in the description below, as it is freely available on YouTube. This video starts off with Justin Trudeau, former Prime Minister of Canada, speaking meaningless words into the camera. There isn't much to talk about of what he says, but as a British person, if there was a history documentary that was played in school, as many of the comments attest happened with this documentary, and our Prime Minister, in fact, any Prime Minister from the last 20 years came onto the screen, I would instantly not trust it and think that it was government propaganda. We then get our introduction to the Indigenous peoples who live in the area that we now call Canada. We have the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee and the Blackfoot Confederacy and a dozen groups out in the west, and that's it. That's everyone. I hope I don't need to explain why this is horrifically egregious of this documentary to assert. The last 600 years of colonization and habitation by Europeans is but a tiny fraction of the at least 13,000 years that human beings have inhabited North America. And what is now Canada was inhabited for the longest out of any place in the whole of the Americas. And it's not like we don't have an understanding of what was going on before the Europeans arrived. Heck, I've had to read plenty of articles and books describing that exact topic. So what excuse does the Canadian government have to not include that history in their documentary? At the very least, they should perhaps mention there were a fair few more Indigenous groups than the ones they just mentioned. The Indigenous population of what is now Canada before Europeans arrived numbers in the millions, if not tens of millions, and they were arranged in a vast array of different groups and governmental systems and societies. Hell, even in the documentary, they show somebody doing ice fishing, which is something that none of the indigenous groups that they mentioned did. It's a trait of the Inuit people, who they don't mention at all. If this documentary was to be done properly, at the very least, half of the first episode should probably be taken up by the histories of the First Nations, if not a whole episode. Anyway, we're about 4 minutes in, and now it's time for the Europeans to arrive, with Samuel de Champlain. I probably butchered that pronunciation because he's French. The video skips over much of the exploration done by Europeans before Champlain. This is understandable, given that most of the previous explorers from the English, Portuguese, French, and Dutch weren't that impactful to the long-term history of Canada. However, there was one explorer whose intentional exclusion, as said by our professor, did annoy a lot of French Canadians. That is Jacques Cartier, which once again, I'm probably pronouncing horrifically. He was the first French explorer to explore what is now Quebec. And as a result, French Canadians hold him as much as a founding figure as Champlain is. And his intentional exclusion annoyed them quite a bit. So, we're only 6 minutes in, and we've already annoyed the entire Indigenous population of Canada and the entire French-Canadian population of Canada. Great job so far, Justin. We then go on to Champlain setting up the first colony of New France in what is now Quebec, with its capital in Quebec City. The video states that Champlain came over to found a nation. This is horrifically egregious as well. The idea of the nation, as we understand it today, and as the video implies, did not exist in the 16th century. It is an invention of the 19th century. Champlain came over to the New World as a servant of the King of France to benefit the King of France in two ways. First, to exploit the fur trade, which the video does mention quite predominantly, but also to then set up a feudal system of agriculture, a feudal system that would continue all the way in to the 19th century. But I'll talk about that a little more later. I also want to take the moment to talk about the guest speakers that they've got on this video to speak. As you will see if you watch the video, there are very few actual historians. Most are actors or other famous individuals. Apart from the Governor-General of Canada, I have no idea who these people are, so I can't speak to whether they're good people or not. I can say that they're very definitely less qualified to speak on these subjects than historians. They do get some historians on, but a lot less than everyone else. An example of such an unqualified person to speak on these issues is this guy who says that,
in terms of their physical ability and capability and survivability, nothing like the wussiness of our age.
This is one of three very ridiculous things that these speakers will say on this video. The idea that somebody in the 16th century with a virtually non-existent conception of personal fitness, personal hygiene, and medicine is somehow more physically fit than people today is completely ridiculous. We then move on to the interactions between Champlain's colony and the indigenous people, primarily the nations of the Wendat. And here they say yet another egregious thing.
The arrival of Europeans begins as an opportunity. Access to the global market.
Here the video argues that both the indigenous people and Champlain were engaged in free market capitalism, that both wished to exploit the fur trade for their own economic benefit in a very capitalistic way. Neither side did this. The idea of free market capitalism does not exist until the 19th century, like the idea of the nation. The French, in particular, will be a nation obsessed with trying to not adopt free market capitalism and keeping a medieval feudal system of economics. This is what Champlain will set up, the seigneurial system of feudal economic structures, not free market capitalism. He will be given a total monopoly of the fur trade in New France. to say that the indigenous people engaged in capitalism this way is just as egregious. They engaged in the fur trade to benefit the aims that they had. And they certainly were not interested in generating profits from the global market. They were interested in achieving their aims. That is, primarily, their wars with the Haudenosaunee, which this video strongly implies originated from this capitalistic competition, which is also not true. The intervention of the Europeans, the Dutch on the side of the Haudenosaunee and the French on the side of the Wendat, certainly did intensify conflict and contribute to the aims of the different nations. But this was not the origin of this conflict, which had been going on long before the Europeans even set foot in the Americas. We are now about halfway through the video. And as it states, the leadership of New France are now interested in expanding the colony, and for that they need a secret ingredient.
Women.
And we cut to the ads. As bad as this documentary is, that made me laugh out loud. As the video mentions, New France has a problem if it wants to be a prosperous colony. There's too many men. Virtually everybody who has come over and settled in the New World is a man, and as a result, there aren't any women, and as a result, you can't have a sustained population there. And so, the King of France has come up with a fantastic idea to resolve this problem. Kidnap women and send them to America. This, of course, is not how the video presents it. They present it as adventurous dreamers going off to the New World to have a better life than they could ever possibly imagine back in Europe. This is completely bullshit. These were women coming from an already horrifically sexist and misogynistic society who were already vulnerable as orphans and as the lowest ranks of the poor, now essentially kidnapped and sent to somewhere else to marry someone that they have never met, and then have up to 10 children. The idea that they were somehow given a choice of who to marry once they arrived is completely egregious, considering that they were taken from their homes in the first place. They were then encouraged, though more likely forced, to have up to 10 children, though likely more, which would be a horrific experience even today, let alone back then, with the non-existent medical technology to help people giving birth. Yet again, we have some of these speakers who say things without any qualification to say them. Like this woman who says,
I'd love to imagine for Elizabeth that she was a dreamer.
How about, instead of getting this random-ass actor to tell us what she was thinking, we actually get a historian who has studied this woman to tell us what she actually felt about what she was experiencing. This is not a story of dreamers and adventurous women going to find a better, freer life in the New World. This essentially amounts to a state-sponsored sex trade. The video then moves on to discussing the establishment of the Western fur trade in the Hudson's Bay Company. There isn't much new to comment on here. The video, as it did with the previous fur trade, establishes that it was the capitalistic destiny of these entrepreneurs to establish this mercantile system. What I find more interesting is what they leave out about this fur trade, about the fur trade in the whole of Canada generally. The video clearly wants to tell the story of strong, independent women, as it did in the previous section, no matter if that isn't actually true of the situations for those women who were brought over from France. It is, however, the case much more for Indigenous women, which I find is a massive missed opportunity if you want to talk about empowering women. Indigenous people, Indigenous women, played an immense role in their societies. I have linked some articles below that I have had to read about it. They're quite interesting, though I don't know if you're able to access them freely, because I can through my university. Particularly when it came to the fur trade, Indigenous women became instrumental. They would marry French fur traders, and through that, the fur traders would gain the indigenous knowledge of how to survive in this land and how to trap and catch the animals that produce the furs. The women in these relationships would often have far more choice than European women could ever imagine. In most cases, they had the final say whether they would actually marry this individual. The children born of these relationships are also an interesting story. Some would go back and be educated as Europeans. Some would go back to the indigenous nations and become indigenous. But some would become a mixture of the two and create an entirely new cultural group within Canada, the Métis. That in itself is a supremely interesting story. Understandably, it isn't present within this video, since the creation of the Métis identity happens outside of the time frame of this documentary. If in the future I analyse any of the future episodes of this series, we'll see how well they do that story justice. When describing the Hudson's Bay Company, the video then states this infuriating statement.
But British land claims to develop on Indigenous territory will create controversy for centuries.
Controversy is an understatement. It serves to play down and obscure the horrific genocide Indigenous people endured within Canada. And whilst they do comment on this for a brief moment, it is quickly forgotten about as we now go to the exciting, adventurous conflict between the French and the English over the fate of North America. The last 10 minutes of the video are spent on a climactic battle between the British and the French over Quebec City. The British, of course, would eventually win and take over all of North America from the French. All of the build-up of why this happened, of how this happened, that this was the culmination of centuries of conflict between the English and French that originated in Europe and have been exported to their colonies across the world is completely ignored, simply for the spectacle of a climactic battle in the founding of Canada's history. They also get this UFC champion to comment on military strategy as if he's the one that's qualified to talk about that subject. And so ends this history video. It is not a history documentary. This is a piece of political propaganda for a specific political ideology, that of the Liberal Party of Canada. And when I say liberal, I don't mean in the way dumb Americans think liberal means. I mean the ideology of liberalism, founded in free market capitalism and the nation state. These ideas only originated in the 19th century, centuries after the events that they describe here. But in this documentary, they commit the cardinal sin of history to imbue our modern ideas onto the past. The fact that this is, as many of the comments on the video attest to, was shown to children in school, clearly shows this was an attempt to paint the world as if the idea of free market capitalism, liberalism, and the nation state have always existed, that all societies throughout history have been trying to get to and achieve. find their use of guest speakers particularly insidious. Instead of getting people whom are actually qualified to speak upon these issues, who have devoted their lives to the study of these historical subjects, they get random actors who will be trusted more without critical thought than somebody who is actually qualified to speak on the history of their nation. This is not a critical history that tells the story of where Canada came from. This is a mythology, a Lord of the Rings style fantasy of the founding of a nation. The only value it holds to the general public is as a case study into the minds of those in the Liberal Party who hope that the public will believe this fantastical story rather than looking at the history of their country critically. And that's the end of my rant. Once again, don't take anything I say seriously. Go read a book for yourself on any of the histories that was talked about in this video. I've left some articles in the description below that I was tasked with reading to understand this history. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee that you'll have access to them, since I am able to get into online archives and libraries through having paid tuition to a university. Next week will finally be International Kitchen, where I can make my bangers and mash for about 20 people. But till the next time, I'll see you later.